So this video will focus on solving proportions and will focus primarily on solving proportions using the cross product strategy. So before we start solving, let's cover a couple of key vocabulary terms. First is a ratio, and a ratio uses division to compare two quantities. So you see ratios all the time in your daily life. This could be something like you traveled 40 miles in 2 hours. Or maybe you spent $75 on 3 video games. Whatever it might be, a ratio uses division in the form of a fraction to compare two quantities. A proportion is an equation then that states that two ratios are equal. So, for example, you could have something like 40 miles in 2 hours really equals and simplifies down to the same thing as 120 miles in 6 hours. So when we have a proportion, we're basically saying that two ratios are equal. If they were to be simplified, they would simplify down to the same value. So a ratio itself is using division to compare two quantities, and a proportion then says that two ratios are equal by putting an equal sign between them. So you'll see a fraction is equal to a fraction. So before I move forward and teach you how to utilize the cross product to solve proportions, I do want to point out that you actually do have the knowledge necessary to solve some proportions without the use of the cross product. So here you'll see that you have a ratio equals a ratio. You have a fraction equals a fraction, and that's a proportion. And from here, our goal when we solve proportions is to find the missing value for the variable, which in this case is x. And hopefully you would be able to tell me that in order to get x by itself, you could easily multiply both sides of that equation by 8. You're currently dividing x by 8, so if you multiply both sides by 8 or 8 over 1, the right-hand side is simply left with x. The left-hand side becomes 8 times 4 is 32. 1 times 5 is 5. So we would find that x is equal to 32 over 5. So if you like this way of solving, this does still work for some proportions, and you can utilize this strategy. The cross product that I'm going to show you on the next slide is just a different strategy that helps you make it a little bit easier when you're solving some very complex proportions. So before I walk you through the cross product, I want to point something out that's very, 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 very important. The cross product only works when we are solving a proportion. So what this means is you have a fraction set equal to a fraction. If you don't have this situation, the cross product does not work. But if you have a fraction equals a fraction and you have a proportion, the cross product is a very quick strategy. So essentially what you do is you take the numerator in the first fraction and you multiply it by the denominator in the second fraction. So that's where we start. So we take numerator in first fraction times denominator in second fraction. So we have 4 times 32. And what we do is we set that equal. So I'm going to write set equal to in there. So that's the first steps we'll take, and I'm actually going to change colors here so it's a little easier to see. So we took 4 times 8 equals, and then our second step here is we're then going to take the numerator in the second fraction and we're going to multiply it by the denominator, in the first fraction. So here I have 5 times x. So ultimately what you see here is we took numerator times other denominator equals numerator times other denominator. So we end up with 4 times 8 equals 5 times x. And then from here, we have an equation that we are able to solve to find the value for x. So 4 times 8 is 32. 5 times x is 5x. If we divide both sides by 5, we find that x is equal to 32 over 5. And if you go back to the previous slide, what you'll notice is that whether we use the cross product or we use that strategy we've talked about previously, for a simple proportion like this, it's pretty easy and you'll end up with the exact same answer of 32/5. So either strategy will work. The cross product just works really well for more complex proportions, which we'll see on the next slide. All right, so we're going to utilize the cross product here to solve the two proportions that we see on the screen. And this is really where cross product is powerful because it helps us to solve some of these more complex proportions. So here I see we have a proportion because we have fraction equals fraction. So I know that I can use the cross product here. So I take numerator in first fraction times denominator in second. So I get 8 times 5 is then equal to numerator in second fraction times the numerator, or the denominator, excuse me, in the first fraction. So I have 6 times 2x. Then from here I start to simplify, so I have 40 equals 12x. And I then want to get the x by itself. So from here I'm going to divide both sides by 12. So I end up with 40 over 12 is equal to x, which is fine, but I know that both of these are divisible by 4. So I'm going to simplify it further, and this becomes x equals 40 divided by 4 is 10, 12 divided by 4 is 3. Then from here, I'm going to move on to the second problem, and this one is a little bit more complicated because I have a numerator with multiple things in it, but luckily I know that there's just hidden parentheses around that. So here, I'm going to change that to keep change. So the same process applies. I take numerator times denominator. So I have 6 plus negative 2m times negative 5 is equal to 4 times m. And then from here, what I note is that I have a set of parentheses here, and I need to distribute. So negative 5 times 6 is negative 30. Plus negative 5 times negative 2 is 10m, which is equal to 4m. Then I note that both sides of the equation are fully simplified, so now I can start solving for m. I also note that the 4 is by itself over here, so I'm going to move the 10m over by adding a negative 10m or subtracting 10m from each side. So then I'm left with negative 30 is equal to negative 6m. Divide both sides by negative 6, and I find that m is equal to a nice, even 5. So in these situations, utilizing the other strategy wouldn't work so well, but cross product really helps prevent us from making a mistake. So if you see fraction equals fraction, cross product is a great little trick that you can use in order to help you solve that very efficiently and effectively.